Once again, I'll remind everybody that, gosh, this is a lot of material, and there's only one thing I can do, and that is hit the highlights of it so that we can continue our conversations, hopefully face to face, about it. There's still a lot of material. So, continuing on with the Scholastic period, that's the 11th century, and what it did with the three arts. And this is, again, the high water mark of the medieval period, and these are the three things that everybody thinks about when they think about medieval rhetoric: the three arts, preaching, letter writing, and poetics. The last slide we looked at was the ars predicandi, or preaching. Dictaminis, guess what? Not as much going on with the ars dictaminis. This seemed to be the big area of some interesting stuff in the Carolingian or early medieval period. Not so much in the later or scholastic portion of the Middle Ages. Anonymous of Bologna is probably the very, very best. There's no question about it. It shows that the Ars Dictaminis was the biggest beneficiary of the classical era. Well, it stands to reason in part because the classical era was a non-Christian era and was used rhetoric quite extensively in secular pursuits, and really the Ars Dictaminis is mostly about secular business and legal and diplomatic writing. So it's going to more readily take up those classical precepts from classical authors. So is a big beneficiary there. Albrecht is really the first to say that Cicero can be applied to letter writing, and it's so accepted by this time, when this guy from Bologna, we don't know his name, so accepted by this time that it's not even addressed in this text. So, using classical sources for letter writing, it's just what you do by this point. And so, Anonymous, whoever he is, just takes that in stride. There are lots of on sections of the different letter of the letter. Obviously, it's very formulaic, of course, and he does lots and lots of stuff on the different sections, especially on salutations. What you really should take away from Anonymous of Bologna's piece is just to show you what finally the most advanced, most sophisticated, most thorough treatment of the Ars Dictaminis ended up looking like in the late Middle Ages, the Scholastic period. But it really isn't the area where all the interesting action is going on by that point. Did it mature in that period? Yes, it did. So did the other two arts. But the other two arts, having farther to go and more area to cover and more interesting ground in our perspective as moderns to cover, are really where all the action is in the later Middle Ages. So let's talk about the third one, the Ars Poetria. And the now this we have to understand what this is exactly. It's really kind of literary analysis. It's the analysis of creative writings. From the perspective of doing kind of a rhetorical reading of it. Later, this kind of art is really going to become literary criticism. And the type of literary criticism that probably would have the most in common with this would be new criticism, right? Just kind of looking at different elements, different aspects of the way a text is put together, that sort of thing. This is really what these kind of guys are doing. They're kind of breaking apart how does a creative work, like a work of poetry, how does it operate on a word level, a sentence level, a structural level, all of that kind of stuff. And this is subsumed under rhetoric. We tend to look at literary criticism and rhetoric as being two different things, although they kind of overlap. Yes, they do. In the 18th century, people in the belletristic tradition would see the two as being very conflated as well, just like this period. But moderns tend to look at literary criticism as being literary criticism and rhetorical analysis as being something that deals with either rhetoric or linguistics or something of that nature. But primarily, these are presentations. When they do these works within the Ars Poetria, are presentations of rhetorical ornamentations, figures of speech, metaphors, simile, all kinds of things, flashbacks, maybe different literary techniques, soliloquies, whatever they are. Right? They foreshadow the development of literary criticism in the Renaissance. Though in the Renaissance, the implications of classical rhetoric are explored even more fully. So what we get here is this new third art, literary analysis, if you want to call it. Poetics is the proper term, poetics, but it deals with more than just poetry. Poetics or literary analysis. This is really beginning to pick up steam because, of course, creative writing, poetry is much more popular in the later Middle Ages than it was in the early Middle Ages. As a result, there's a need for a way to understand it, a need for a way to teach it, a need for a way to analyze it. And so this is where a lot of the attention is focused when people study medieval rhetoric, is, the poetics. And it doesn't get any better than Geoffrey of Vinsauf. Maybe another name that you might want to read if you get a chance would be Matthew of Vendôme, and Gervase of Melcley also is a prominent person. But Geoffrey of Vinsauf is a great example of it. It's doesn't get any better. Tremendously comprehensive look at rhetoric as applied to poetry. Okay. Now, note how the work is organized roughly according to the five canons. I mean, the whole work is structured kind of, sort of, roughly like the five canons of rhetoric. It's kind of a clever thing that he's done there. Note also, all throughout, we'll take a look at this in our discussion, the Ciceronian and Horatian influences all over the place, especially Horace. Very important. The work seems heavily grammatical because poetics were still largely treated as grammar. He's making the case that it belongs under rhetoric. We might not put it there, as I said, as moderns, but it seems heavily grammatical because they're looking at poetics as something that is the study of how language is put together, and that's kind of a linguistic grammatical thing, right? We look at it as more on the artistic side and therefore not so much grammar. But something else. Lots and lots of material here on arrangement. Look at how much he dedicates to arrangement. And it's very scholastic in its tendency to classify. One of the things about medieval scholarship, and especially scholasticism, was this almost obsession with classifying and ordering and hierarchies and things like this. I mean, look at, for example, Dante's Inferno. You got, like, how many levels of hell are there down there? I mean, gosh, there's level. I mean, if hell had an elevator in Dante, it would be, like the Sears Tower building in Chicago. There'd be a level for everything. So the medieval mind obsessed almost with classifying and cataloging and recording and categorizing and dividing and subdividing. And boy, this work is a real doozy on that one. Why is it called the New Poetics? Right? Because that's what the title translates into. Well, interesting thing here. De Inventione, which is Cicero, they didn't know it was written by Cicero, but we do, right? And the Ad Horinum were considered the old and new rhetorics. Actually, I have those kind of reversed there because the Ad Horinum was probably beforehand. But that's kind of the argument there. The De Inventione was something that came along a little bit later to him. Horace's Ars Poetica, that should be Poetica, or Art of Poetry, right, was the Poetria. Okay, this is the new Ars Poetica, therefore it is the new Poetria. So as De Inventione and Ad Horinum were old and new rhetorics that can be analyzed, that were handed down, what Geoffrey of Vinsauf is doing is a little bit full of himself here. That is, Horace was the old poetics, my book is the new poetics, and so hence the title. That's a pretty modern thing to do in a period of time, the Middle Ages, when it was very backward looking, it was very synoptic, it was very summative rather than original. Here's Geoffrey of Vinsauf saying it's time for a new poetry. That's just not a thing you hear in the Middle Ages very often in any discipline, much less rhetoric. But that's where we leave off there with some foreshadowings when we get to class about what you can expect when you begin to study early Renaissance material.